The laughter is the thing I remember most clearly. Not the reading of the will. Not the way my Uncle Gerald folded his hands across his stomach with that practiced solemnity of a man who has attended too many of these proceedings. Not even the moment my brother Marcus leaned over to our mother and whispered something that made the corner of her mouth curl upward in a way she didn't bother to hide. The laughter, hers specifically. Low, contained, but unmistakable. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to appear polite while communicating, with perfect efficiency, that they consider you beneath contempt. My name is Nora Callahan Voss. I was 31 years old on the afternoon my grandfather's estate was formally divided. I was wearing a gray blazer I'd bought on sale from a department store that had since gone out of business. My shoes had a scuff on the left toe that I'd meant to buff out the night before and forgotten. These are the details that stay with you. The small evidence of a life lived just slightly under pressure. Never drowning, never quite comfortable enough to stop paying attention to the small things. My grandfather, Edmund Callahan, had built Callahan Strategic Consulting over 42 years. He started it in a spare bedroom in South Boston with a single client, a regional insurance company that needed someone to reorganize their actuarial department. By the time he died at 79, the firm employed 63 people, held contracts with 7 Fortune 500 companies, and had an annual revenue that the family, in their various ways, had spent the better part of 2 decades orbiting like moons around something that warmed them without them ever needing to understand it. My grandfather understood me. That is perhaps the single most important sentence in everything that follows. He understood me the way people rarely understand their quieter grandchildren. Not through conversation exactly, but through observation. Through the way he noticed, when I was 12, that I'd reorganized his bookshelves not by size or color the way my cousins might have, but by subject, and then chronologically within subject. Through the way he handed me, when I was 17, a copy of a management consulting framework document he'd written in 1987 and watched my face while I read it. I didn't look up for 40 minutes. When I did, he was still watching, and he smiled. He never gave me a job at the firm. He gave me something else. He paid for my graduate degree in organizational systems at MIT, quietly, without announcement, in a way that allowed my parents to believe it was a student loan situation I'd somehow managed on my own. He sent me articles. He called me on Tuesday evenings to talk about specific problems he was working through. He never once, in my memory, asked me what my brother Marcus was doing or whether I was dating anyone or when I planned to settle down. He just talked to me like I was a person whose mind was worth engaging. When he died, a Tuesday in November which felt somehow appropriate, his lawyer, a precise woman named Sylvia Chen, called each family member separately to schedule the reading of the will. She called me last, which I noticed but did not read into at the time. The reading took place at the firm's offices on the 44th floor of a building in downtown Boston. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the harbor. My mother, Patricia, sat to my right in a black St. John's suit that had probably cost more than my monthly rent. My brother Marcus, who had worked at the firm since he was 24 and was now a senior partner, sat across from me. His wife, Deirdre, was not present but had apparently been texting him throughout because I watched him glance at his phone 11 times before Sylvia Chen even opened the folder. My father, Robert, who had technically retired from the firm 8 years ago, but continued to draw a consulting fee and maintain an office, sat at the far end of the table reading something on his tablet until Sylvia cleared her throat with professional authority. There were other relatives, cousins, an aunt from my grandmother's side, a few family friends who had been named in earlier codicils and were there for the distribution of specific personal property. The room had the particular atmosphere of people performing grief while calculating at the same time. Sylvia read through the bequests in order: art pieces, the house in Chatham, cash trusts for the grandchildren. The family friends received what they were there to receive and were quietly ushered out by an assistant. Then she reached the firm itself. The distribution was clean, if expected. Marcus received 38%. My father received 12% in a structured trust. 2 senior partners received 5% each. Various other provisions followed, small percentages to employees who had been with the firm for more than 20 years. And then Sylvia said my name. She said it without looking up from the document, which I later understood was intentional. To my granddaughter, Nora Callahan Voss, she read, I bequeath the following: all remaining intellectual property holdings, registered under the subsidiary entity Callahan IP Holdings LLC, including but not limited to patents, trade methodologies, and proprietary frameworks developed between 1987 and 2019, as documented in Schedule C attached hereto. The room was quiet for approximately 3 seconds. Then my mother laughed. It was not the full, unguarded laugh she used at parties. It was the smaller, more pointed version. The one that communicated, without the vulgarity of actual words, that something was not worth taking seriously. Marcus made a sound that was almost, but not quite, a scoff. My father set down his tablet. My mother leaned toward me with the expression of someone explaining something to a child. "Intellectual property," she said. "That's the old documents, the frameworks he wrote. Nora, those are just internal materials. They've been superseded." I nodded. I said nothing. Sylvia Chen was still looking at the folder. Marcus poured himself a glass of water and said, "I'm sure they have some archival value." His tone was generous in the specific way of someone who is distributing charity from a position of confirmed superiority. I folded my copy of the document into my bag and thanked Sylvia. I shook everyone's hands. I left. In the elevator, I was alone. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal door. I had known for approximately 7 years that the laugh was coming. I had spent those 7 years preparing for what would come after it. Here is something that most people do not know about intellectual property law, and specifically about methodological patents in the consulting sector. The frameworks and trade methodologies developed by a consulting firm, if properly documented and registered, do not belong automatically to the firm. They belong to whoever holds the IP registration. My grandfather had been very precise about this. Meticulously, almost obsessively precise. I had known about Callahan IP Holdings LLC for 6 years. My grandfather had told me about it on a Tuesday call in the spring when I was 25 and finishing my 2nd year at MIT. He did not frame it as a disclosure of inheritance. He framed it as an education. He walked me through the structure the way he always walked me through things, methodically, without editorializing, letting the facts speak with the weight they deserved. "The methodologies are what the firm actually sells," he said. "The people are the delivery mechanism. But the frameworks, the structured diagnostic approaches, the organizational mapping systems, the risk stratification models, those are protectable, and I protected them." He had registered 12 proprietary frameworks as trade methodologies with the United States Patent and Trademark Office between 1994 and 2018. He had consolidated their ownership into Callahan IP Holdings LLC in 2009, following advice from an IP attorney who had understood, as Edmund did, that separation of operational assets from intellectual assets was not merely organizational prudence. It was, in the right circumstances, a form of power. The firm, Callahan Strategic Consulting, had been licensing these frameworks from the LLC. The licensing agreement was embedded in the firm's operating contracts, renewed annually, for a fee that was internal and therefore never disclosed in the summary financial reports that family members periodically received. The fee was modest, structured that way deliberately, but the agreement carried a provision that was anything but modest. I am going to state this clearly because it is the hinge on which everything else turned. The licensing agreement contained a reversion clause. If the ownership of the IP Holdings LLC changed, which it now had as of the reading of the will, the new owner had the right to review, renegotiate, or terminate the existing licensing terms within 60 days of transfer. And if the licensing agreement was terminated, the firm would lose the legal right to use the frameworks. Not the physical documents, which were proprietary. Not the methodology names, which were trademarked. Not the client-facing language, which had been systematically built around the frameworks over 4 decades. All of it would revert to the LLC, to me. I had spent 6 years preparing for this moment. I had completed my MIT degree with a specialization in organizational systems and intellectual property management. I had taken a position at a mid-sized IP consulting firm in Cambridge. Deliberately not at Callahan, deliberately at a place where I would learn the mechanics of exactly this kind of asset transfer without anyone in my family noticing what I was learning. I had worked with attorneys. I had commissioned an independent valuation of the IP Holdings portfolio. I had drafted, with legal counsel, a transition plan that was 37 pages long and had been reviewed 3 times, I had not told my parents. I had not told Marcus. I had not told anyone in the family because my grandfather had asked me not to, and because I had agreed that the timing mattered enormously. He was right about that. I was right to wait. In the 48 hours following the reading of the will, 3 things happened. First, I met with Sylvia Chen privately. She handed me the Schedule C document in its complete form, 41 pages detailing every registered methodology, every trademark, every piece of documentation, and the complete terms of the licensing agreement with the firm. She also handed me a sealed letter from my grandfather, handwritten, dated 18 months before his death. I will not read the letter in full here. Some things are private, but I will say that it began. You were always the one who actually read the documents. And it ended with a single instruction. Be fair, be firm, be precise, in that order. Second, I retained an IP litigation attorney, a woman named Deborah Marsh, whose firm had handled 3 major consulting IP disputes in the past decade, and who had reviewed the Callahan Framework registrations 2 years earlier at my request, on a preliminary basis. She confirmed what I already knew. The registrations were valid. The reversion clause was enforceable. The valuation of the portfolio, updated by her firm's financial analysts, came in at between $11 and $14 million, depending on the revenue projections used. Third, I called my mother. Not to tell her any of this. I called because she called me, the morning after the reading, in the tone she used for things she considered settled. She said she hoped I understood that the archive materials would need to remain physically at the firm's offices for continuity. She said they'd had Gerald look into it, and apparently the old documents were really just internal to the operation. She said very gently that I might want to speak with their attorney about signing something straightforward that would formalize the arrangement. I said I would look into it. I spent the following 10 days in meetings, legal preparation, document review, valuation confirmation. I had one final conversation with Deborah Marsh where I laid out 3 possible paths forward. The first was a full licensing renegotiation. The firm would continue to use the frameworks but under new terms at fair market value, which would generate ongoing revenue for me and maintain business continuity for them. The second was a structured buyout, in which the firm purchased the IP Holdings LLC from me at the assessed valuation. The third was termination of the licensing agreement, which would require the firm to either develop new frameworks or stop using the existing ones within a defined contractual window. Deborah asked me which I preferred. I said I preferred whichever one my family chose. After I had explained the situation to them clearly and given them a reasonable opportunity to respond in the good faith. She said, "And if they don't respond in good faith?" I told her I had already accounted for that. On the 12th day after the will reading, I sent a formal letter, via certified mail to my father, to Marcus at the firm, and to the firm's general counsel, outlining the legal status of Callahan IP Holdings LLC, the reversion clause, the 60-day review window that had now begun, and the 3 options for resolution. The letter was 8 pages. It was written by Deborah's office. It was precise, professional, and comprehensive. It included the USPTO registration numbers for all 12 frameworks and a summary of the independent valuation. I also sent a copy to Sylvia Chen because she had earned the courtesy of knowing. Then I waited. The response came in 36 hours. It was not a letter. It was a phone call from my father at 7:14 in the morning, in a tone I had not heard from him before. Not anger exactly, not yet, but something compressed and airless, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. He said, "What is this?" Not a question, a statement of a thing he was refusing to accommodate. I said, "It's the legal documentation of your licensing arrangement with Callahan IP Holdings LLC and notification that the ownership of that LLC has transferred to me as of the date of the reading of the will." He said, "Your grandfather would not have intended this." I said, "He wrote me a letter explaining exactly what he intended. I'd be happy to share it with you at the appropriate time." There was a pause that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then my father said, "We need to have a family meeting." I said, "Of course, I'm available Thursday evening. My attorney will also be available if the firm's counsel would like to be present." Another pause. He said, "This is not the way this is supposed to go." I said, "Dad, I know this is hard. I want to find a resolution that works. But I need you to understand that I'm serious, and the documents are real, and the timeline is already running." He hung up. The family meeting took place on a Thursday evening at my parents' house in Newton. I arrived at 6:45 with Deborah, who had the particular quality of stillness that very good attorneys develop. Not coldness, but a kind of measured presence that communicates that she has been in rooms like this before and is not troubled by what happens in them. My parents' house has a formal sitting room that is used approximately 4 times a year. It was set up the way people set up rooms when they want to communicate seriousness. Chairs arranged, fresh flowers on the side table, which struck me as a very particular kind of strange, and a pitcher of water that no one touched. Marcus was there with his wife Deirdre. My father's attorney, a man named Paulson, who had handled the family's legal matters for 15 years, was seated in the corner with a leather portfolio. My mother sat in the chair she always sat in, which was positioned slightly higher than the sofa where I was directed to sit, which I recognized as the kind of arrangement that happens without anyone consciously choosing it. Deborah and I sat together. I had a folder. She had a briefcase she did not open. My father opened the meeting. He said that the family had had time to review the documentation and that everyone agreed. Here he looked at Paulson, who nodded, that there were some significant questions about the interpretation of the reversion clause and whether it had been properly disclosed to the firm over the years, and whether there might be grounds to argue that the licensing arrangement had functioned effectively as an assignment rather than a license. He was reading from notes. Deborah let him finish. Then she opened her briefcase and placed 3 documents on the coffee table. The first was the complete licensing agreement between Callahan Strategic Consulting and Callahan IP Holdings LLC, executed in 2009 and renewed most recently in 2021. It contained the reversion clause in Section 14B, highlighted in yellow. The second was a memo from 2021, signed by my father as a then officer of the firm, acknowledging receipt of the annual license renewal and confirming understanding of all terms, including the reversion provisions. The third was a letter from the firm's own legal counsel, dated 2019, in which they had reviewed the LLC structure and confirmed to the partners that the IP holdings were separately owned and licensed, and that the licensing arrangement was subject to the terms as written. Marcus looked at the 2021 document for a long moment. Then he looked at our father. My mother said, "These are just internal documents. Edmund would never have structured this to harm the firm." I said, very carefully, "He didn't structure it to harm the firm. He structured it to ensure that the value he created wasn't distributed in a way that ignored the people who contributed to it. The frameworks I inherited are worth between $11 and $14 million on independent assessment. The firm has been licensing them for a fee that Deborah can confirm was well below fair market value. Structurally so, as a subsidy to operations. That subsidy transferred with the LLC." My brother said, "You're saying you're going to hold the firm hostage." I said, "No, I'm saying I own an asset that the firm currently depends on, and I would like to negotiate fair terms for its continued use, or alternatively, to sell it to the firm at assessed value. I've offered 3 options. All 3 are reasonable. I'm not here to destroy anything." Paulson interjected, carefully because he is a careful man, that the firm might challenge the valuation. Deborah said they were welcome to commission their own independent valuation, and that we were confident any credible assessment would fall within the range we'd provided, given the USPTO registrations and the firm's documented revenue attributable to the frameworks over the preceding decade. My mother looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down. Not the managed, social look she usually offered, but something else. Something that had more weather in it. She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I said, "Because it was the truth and because I had earned the right to say it. Because you laughed at the will reading before I'd even stood up from the chair." The room was very quiet after that. Not the negotiating silence. The other kind. My father said after a moment that they would need time to review. I said, "Of course, you have 48 days remaining under the 60-day window. I'd like to reach an agreement in that time. I'm genuinely open to any of the 3 paths I've outlined." I paused. "But I need you to understand that I will pursue the third option. Termination. If no agreement is reached, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you that not as a threat, but as a fact. The same way you would tell a client. My father nodded. He did not look at me when he did it. Deborah and I drove back to Cambridge in near silence. She said somewhere on the highway, "You handled that well." I said, "It didn't feel like anything. It felt like presenting a report." She said, "That's usually when people handle things well." The next 3 weeks were conducted entirely through attorneys. Paulson's office filed a preliminary challenge to the IP valuation methodology. Standard procedure, nothing personal. A tactic designed to buy time and create the impression of leverage. Deborah responded with a supplemental analysis from a second independent IP valuation firm, which came in at $12, $4 million, squarely in the middle of our range. There was a mediation session that lasted 6 hours and ended without resolution, primarily because Marcus spent the first 3 hours insisting that the reversion clause had never been meaningfully communicated to the partners. Despite the 2021 memo his father had signed, which was in the room on a table and which everyone in the room could see, and which no one on his side successfully explained away. There was a counterproposal in week 3. The firm offered to buy out the LLC for $2 million, contingent on a 5-year non-compete that would have prevented me from working in any consulting adjacent field. The offer was delivered with language that made it sound like generosity. I rejected it in writing in 4 sentences. In week 4, the firm's largest client, a healthcare systems company that had been with Callahan for 11 years, received, through entirely routine channels, a copy of the framework documentation that was publicly registered with the USPTO. This was not something I arranged. USPTO records are public. I have no reason to believe the client looked at them, but I do know that the healthcare systems company's legal team contacted the firm to ask about the ownership status of the methodologies being used in their current engagement. The call came from Marcus to Deborah's office on a Wednesday afternoon, not to mine. He did not, in the end, call me. The firm came back with a new offer in week 5, $9, $8 million for the LLC, structured as an immediate payment of $6 million and an earnout over 3 years based on revenue attributable to the frameworks. No non-compete, no conditions on my future work, a formal acknowledgement in the purchase agreement of the asset's independent value and my legal right to it. It was not the full valuation. But it was serious. I took it to Deborah. She said it was defensible. She said I could push harder, but that I'd be looking at litigation. And litigation would cost both sides money and time and would likely end in roughly the same place. She said it was my decision. I thought about what my grandfather had written. Be fair, be firm, be precise, in that order. I said I wanted 2 modifications. First, the earnout structure needed a guaranteed floor. I would accept lower variable payments in exchange for a minimum threshold that insulated me from the firm choosing to reduce their use of the frameworks to depress the earnout calculation. Second, I wanted the agreement to include an explicit representation from the firm that the IP had always been legally owned by the LLC and that the transfer to me was valid and uncontested. Not because I needed the validation, I knew the law, but because I wanted it in writing, permanently, in a document that would outlast any of our memories of the morning someone laughed. They accepted both modifications. The purchase agreement was executed on a Friday morning at Sylvia Chen's office. A choice I had made deliberately because Sylvia was the person who had read the will, and I wanted her to witness the end of what had begun in that room. Total realized value, $9, $8 million, plus the guaranteed floor on the earnout that my attorneys subsequently estimated at a minimum additional $600,000. I want to be careful here because this is the part that people expect to be triumphant. And it was not, exactly. It was something more complicated than triumph. It was the feeling of a long breath finally released. And then the particular quiet that follows, which turns out to have a weight of its own. My mother called me 3 days after the agreement was signed. She asked if I would have lunch with her. I went. We sat at a restaurant in Back Bay that she had always preferred. White tablecloths, very good fish, waiters who recognized her by name. She was wearing a navy dress that I had always liked on her. She ordered a glass of white wine and spent a long time looking at the menu, before ordering something she'd ordered there 100 times. She said, "I want to say something." I waited. She said, "I think your grandfather knew you better than I did, and I've been thinking about what that means about the time that passed." It was not an apology exactly. My mother is not someone who uses the word apology the way other people use it. But it was something, a reaching across the table that she did not dress up or make smaller by overdressing it. I said, "I know you didn't laugh to be cruel. I think you didn't take it seriously because it didn't look like something serious from where you were standing." She said, "I should have known better. Edmund didn't do anything by accident." I said, "No, he didn't." We ate our fish. She asked me about my work. I told her about a project I'd been developing, a methodological consulting framework of my own, built on different foundations than the Callahan systems, something I'd been building slowly for 3 years. She listened more carefully than she normally listened. I noticed that and did not say anything about it. When we left, she hugged me in the way she hugged people she was uncertain about, carefully, with effort. I drove home thinking about what closure actually means and whether it is ever the thing we imagine it will be. I don't think it is. I think it is smaller and stranger and more provisional than the word suggests. I think what actually happens is that the wound doesn't disappear. It just stops being the center of everything. You stop organizing your life around the absence of something and start organizing it around what's actually there. There are things I need to say about the firm because they are true and because this story would be dishonest without them. Callahan Strategic Consulting did not collapse. I want to be precise about that because the title of this account might suggest otherwise. And I said at the outset that I would be precise. The firm did not lose a client over this. Marcus did not resign. The firm's operations continued. What they lost was approximately $8 million in cash, which they paid to me and which they had to raise through a combination of debt financing and a structured reduction of partner distributions over 2 years. That is not nothing. For a firm of 63 people with ongoing overhead, that is a genuinely significant cost. What they also lost, and this is harder to quantify but more important, they lost the assumption. The assumption that the frameworks were theirs by right. The assumption that the family's professional assets were distributed along the lines of visibility and presence, and the kind of competence that announces itself in meetings and on business cards. The assumption that what you laugh at can't come back. Marcus called me in the 4th month after the agreement closed. We had not spoken since the Thursday meeting in Newton. He said, "I want to understand something." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Did you know the whole time? When you were at MIT?" I said, "Grandfather told me about the structure when I was 25. I spent the following 6 years preparing for it." There was a pause. He said, I thought you were doing your own thing. The separate career, the distance from the firm. He stopped. "I thought you'd walked away." I said, "I know." He said, That's not a comfortable thing to know." I said, "No, it isn't." He asked me then, a question I hadn't expected. He said, "Do you think grandfather was right to set it up this way?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about Tuesday calls and a bookshelf organized by subject. I thought about a man who had built something over 42 years and had watched, in his later life, the way different people in his family understood what he'd built and who had built it. I said, "I think he wanted to make something true. I think he looked at the firm and he looked at his family and he could see that there was a version of events where everything he'd created was absorbed into a story, where certain people mattered and other people were considered scenery. And I think he didn't want that version of events to be the one that lasted." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, the frameworks, we're building on them. The team has been going deeper into the methodology. Now that we actually own it properly, we're treating it differently. Like it's infrastructure rather than just habit." I said, "That's the right way to use them." He said, "Grandfather always said you understood them better than any of us." I said, "He said a lot of things on Tuesday nights. We didn't say anything else of substance after that. But it was, for us, a considerable conversation. Here is what the money meant and what it did not mean. $10 million, approximate, is not the point of this story. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be easy to hear this account and conclude that the point was financial victory, and it wasn't. The point was recognition of a thing that was real. That's what my grandfather was giving me, more than money. He was giving me the evidence, in legal and documented form, that the work I had done was real, that the capacity I had was real, that the years of Tuesday calls and MIT frameworks and quiet preparation were real. The money is what happens when a thing that is real is properly accounted for. That's all. I bought an apartment. I funded 3 years of runway for the consulting methodology I'd been building, the one I mentioned to my mother over lunch. I made a donation to the MIT Organizational Systems program that was large enough to name a visiting fellowship, but small enough that I could make it without my name becoming attached to it publicly. I am, in this as in most things, not especially interested in announcements. The fellowship is named after my grandfather, Edmund Callahan Visiting Fellowship in Organizational Systems. It funds doctoral researchers working on intellectual property and professional services. He would have appreciated that it's specific. I think about the laugh sometimes, not obsessively, not the way I used to in the years when I was building toward a future I couldn't talk about, when I would sit in meetings at the Cambridge firm and think about what was coming and feel the particular loneliness of being the only one in the room who knew the full shape of a story you couldn't yet tell. I think about it the way you think about weather you drove through once. It happened. It was real. It informed where I went and how I got there. My mother does not laugh at me anymore. I don't think she laughed at me maliciously. I said this to her and I meant it. I think she laughed because I was invisible to her in a particular way, and the invisibility made the inheritance look like nothing, because she had never quite seen what I was. That invisibility was the greatest gift she ever gave me, even though she gave it without meaning to. There's a specific kind of power that comes from being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. It means they don't see you coming. It means your preparation is uninterrupted. It means that when you finally stand up from the chair and walk out of the room, you are already farther along than anyone in that room has realized. My grandfather saw me. He protected what he saw. He put it in writing and registered it with the United States government and built a 60-day reversion clause around it, and wrote me a handwritten letter that I keep in the top drawer of my desk, unframed. Because it doesn't need to be a decoration. It's a document, the most important one I own. The last thing I want to say is this. There is a version of this story where I am the villain. I know that. My family lived that version for several months, and I cannot tell you whether some of them still live it because some of them don't call and I don't press the matter. In that version, I concealed information. I sprung a legal trap. I leveraged grief and a transition moment to extract money from a family institution. I have heard through channels that this is approximately how the story is told at certain family dinners I am not invited to. I do not spend time arguing against that version. The documents exist. The legal history exists. The 40-year record of my grandfather's intention exists. People will tell the story they need to tell. What I know, what I can account for with the same precision I apply to everything else, is that I was given a specific inheritance by a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He gave it to me because he believed I would understand it, protect it, and deploy it in the manner it deserved. He was right on all 3 counts. He also believed that the process of claiming it would require me to become fully and without apology the person I had always been building toward being. He was right about that too. The best inheritance is never the thing itself. It's what you have to become to receive it properly. I became it. And when I walked out of that attorney's office on a Friday morning with a signed purchase agreement and a bank wire confirmation pending, I was wearing a blazer that didn't have any scuffs on the shoes. I had remembered to buff them the night before. Small things, the details you carry forward after the large things are settled. I carry them all.